Although this session is not a debate, I feel like it's kind of the main event of the evening. We have two true heavyweights in their respective fields talking about the nature of reality, consciousness and reality. And it's my great pleasure to introduce the first speaker. He is Dr. Deepak Chopra, recently named professor at the University of California, San Diego. Also founder of the Chopra Foundation and the Chopra Center in Carlsbad. The author of so many books, 80, 90 books, something like that. World-renowned spiritual leader. I mentioned the other night that Time Magazine a few years ago ranked the world's most influential spiritual leaders. The Pope was third, Dalai Lama was second, and Deepak was number one. So without further ado, Dr. Deepak Chopra talking about the human universe. Deepak.
Thank you, Stuart. So I'm going to take the first 30 minutes to talk about what I think is ultimate reality. And then David will talk about whatever he talks about. So according to the science of paleolinguistic anthropology, if we can call it a science, till about 40,000 years ago, there were about 8 species of humans. 8 species of humans. And they were as different as a dog is from a fox is, from a wolf is, but they all came from the same family. Then about 40,000 years ago, there was something called the cognitive revolution, when one species, Homo sapiens, that's us. Sapiens means the wise ones. We were arrogant enough to give us that name. But one species developed a language which was more than cat calls or danger calls or mating calls. It was a language that started with gossip and then started to tell stories about things that were not visible. Only humans do that, by the way, tell stories about things that are not visible. I don't think you can convince a monkey to give up its banana on the promise of millions of bananas in monkey heaven. But human beings can tell any story and get away with it. And as a result of this storytelling, especially after written language was developed, our brain grew explosively. The brain's growth in human beings is a result of storytelling and modeling, and asking the basic questions that we've been discussing here this week. Who are we? What's the nature of the universe? And what's happening? So this was the first story that reached critical mass. God created the universe and is the source and origin of life and mind. There were many similar stories in many cultures. And then the second story didn't happen till the classical universe was described by Isaac Newton. And you can see all the principles there. And these were some of the luminaries. And this is all happening in the last few hundred years. And then this basic premise of this story was, or this model was, that the classic universe is ruled by fixed laws of nature, known through human reason and logic. And this story was very successful till Einstein, who then gave us a different story, which is both first the theory of relativity, the special theory, where the speed limit of light is a constant, and it's a constant for all frames of reference, and the general theory of relativity, which basically described gravity as a wrinkle in space-time. As I was looking at Einstein's quotes on this, there's one interview where he was asked to describe the general theory of relativity as simply as possible for the lay person. And this is what Einstein said. He said, before my theory, everybody believed that if you took out all the objects in the universe, what you would be left with is empty space. But after my theory, what I'm saying is, if you took out all the objects from the universe, even space-time would disappear. This is a very important insight. If you took out all the objects from the universe, space-time would disappear. So what would be left? What would be left is something you can't even imagine, because all your imagination is a result of experiences in space-time. I'll repeat that. What would be left is inconceivable, because all your imagination and conceptualization is a result of experience in space-time. So I want to come back to this point in a little while. The relativistic universe is much more dynamic, and space-time and matter are all interdependent in this universe. These were some of the other people who showed up in Einstein's life. As you know, Einstein was a little uncomfortable with the quantum universe, which then emerged with all these luminaries that you see, and basically quantum mechanics left us with these things that we've been talking about all week here with some of the quantum scientists. Major principles here: uncertainty principles, superposition, and now non-locality. The problem, though, with quantum mechanics is that although Schrödinger's equation is very useful for making calculations, nobody really agrees on the different interpretations of quantum mechanics. So how do we define interpretations? Interpretations are sets of statements which attempt to explain quantum mechanics beyond the recipes it gives for performing calculations. And this question is of special interest to both philosophers and physicists. So if you take the trouble to go to Wikipedia, these are some of the interpretations of quantum mechanics. And it should be clear from this chart, and this is only a partial chart, that no one agrees. What does quantum mechanics mean? It's, as I said, a great Schrödinger's equation works. It produces probabilities of space-time events. But what does it mean? Where is consciousness? Does consciousness have a role? All of that is up for debate here. So, according to the Copenhagen interpretation, the wave function collapses when a measurement is performed. Until recently, the Copenhagen interpretation has been the most popular. But recently, as you've heard in all these discussions, if you read the literature, many worlds theory, meta-worlds theory seem to have gained popularity. And then this quantum universe has led to many mathematical guessing games. So this is current literature about what the nature of the universe could be. Eternal inflation, also called chaotic inflation, superstrings, many worlds, multiverse, M-theory, which is a combination of many theories. And of course, we know that none of these theories we have data or observations, because we cannot make data or observations for anything that gets to Planck scale. So when you get to Planck time or Planck scale in any dimension, there's no data available because there's nothing to measure. So this has all led to what I think we can call the uncertain universe. The fabric of nature has already almost reached a dead end. And to complicate things now, there's dark matter, dark energy. And between the two, that's 95% of the universe. Of the remaining 5%, 4% is invisible interstellar dust. And according to Joel Primack, who is one of the discoverers of this theory, or the originators of this theory, the visible universe in the form of stars and planets, which is billions and billions and billions of them, and possibly trillions of planets, is 0.01% of the universe. So what I'd like to propose today is possibly a solution to this whole conundrum, and that is the conscious universe. That random events may not be enough to explain the fine-tuning of the universe, the fine-tuning of the laws of nature, and the rise of life on Earth. As I said, the atomic universe, including interstellar dust, is 4%. However, the nature of atoms remains mysterious, as subatomic particles are also probability waves in mathematical space. So based on the undeniable fact that any universe is only knowable through the human mind's ability to perceive it, to perceive reality, and if all human knowledge is rooted in consciousness, perhaps what we are viewing as a perceptual experience is not the real universe, based on limitations of our brain, and perhaps there are as many universes as there are states of consciousness. And I'm borrowing a word here from Don Hoffman, who I think is going to be here this morning, that we are conscious agents, or what I would call species of consciousness, who create reality in our own image. That the universe is basically consciousness. So this is this very ancient Indian phrase, aham brahmasmi. It means I am the universe. Brahman is consciousness, and Brahmand is the manifestation of consciousness as the visible universe. And there's another Sanskrit phrase, it says, tattvam asi, you are that, I am that, all this is that, and that's all there is. In other words, there's only consciousness. However, and I have to thank David for this insight that I had in a week of silent meditation, because I had originally been introduced to the word qualia through his seminal lecture many years ago on the mystery of qualia, or the hard problem. And so what I'm going to share with you is the foundation for what could be a science of consciousness in the form of qualia principles. But before I do that, let me get into a very fundamental idea and see if I can get you to agree with me. So the normal thinking is, at least in science, the normal thinking is, because science is based on subject-object split, right? Me, the observer, and that which I observe. So normal thinking is, there's me, and there's everything else. There's me, and there's the mountain. There's me, there's the stars and galaxies. There's me, and you. But think about it. There's everything. Me, that I call the body-mind, is also an activity of everything. So, in short, there's only everything, and we have to try and figure out now what the nature of that everything is. So think about it this way. If you could get outside of your body, these days there's so much talk about out-of-body experiences. I think the real mystery is the in-body experience. How do you have an in-body experience without being in the body? Because if I went inside your body, there's nobody there. There's a brain, there's a nervous system, there's a body, but there's no homunculus somewhere in your brain. I would also like to suggest that we use the phrase body-mind, just like we use the phrase space-time in the same way. Or you use the phrase mass energy. Use the phrase body-mind as a single idea. So there's this body-mind experience, and there's the experience of everything else. And I would like to suggest that this body-mind, which at the moment I'm calling Deepak Chopra, and everything else, is not just an integrated activity, but it's a unified wholeness of experience. You need this body-mind to experience everything else. But what is at the basis of this body-mind and everything else as a whole, unified wholeness of experience? And that is what I want to call the true self, not the ego identity, where I think there's somebody here, a socially induced hallucination, but a true self which is generating qualia, and by qualia I mean sensations, images, feelings, thoughts, modalities of knowing, intuition, thinking, mathematics, anything that you can call an experience. And it is experiencing this true body-mind, this true self, is experiencing the body-mind as a collection of qualia, and is experiencing at the same time the universe as a collection of qualia. That is who you really are. The ego identity is a socially induced, constricted awareness of qualia, and its complementarity is the observed universe, but they're actually one single unified activity in consciousness. And when you say, where is this consciousness? It's probably not the right question. Because as soon as you say where, you imply a location in time to something that doesn't exist in time. You imply a location in space that something doesn't occupy space. So consciousness is then the formless, primitive, ontological being. Consciousness is the primitive, ontological, formless entity without which there would be no experience of form. If consciousness had a form, we would be able to see it. If consciousness had any kind of location in space-time, we would be able to measure it. And perhaps consciousness is what Einstein was talking about, not that he said this, but I'm saying this, that if you took away every perceptual and cognitive experience that we have, what you would be left with is dimensionless. What you would be left with is formless. What you'd be left with is actually inconceivable, because even our imagination and conceptualization is a result of experiences in space-time. And as I'm thinking about this, I would also like to suggest that just like we use space-time as one phrase, body-mind as one phrase, I would like to replace the word physical universe with the word perceptual universe, which would apply to the classical universe. Because what we call the classical universe is the perceptual experience. You can't deny that. If there's a classical universe outside of our perceptual experience, we have no access to it. At what we call the quantum universe, I would like to apply the phrase perceptual and cognitive universe. Because whatever reality is that we experience it perceptually and cognitively as modes of experience. This is the universe as we experience it. That's the perceptual universe, classical universe. And there's another universe that we now call the quantum universe, which we have both perceptual and cognitive basis for, whether it's mathematics, or it is calculation, or it is looking at the trail of a particle in a hadron collider. But in other words, no matter what we're talking about, cognitive or perceptual, it is a mode or a modality or a modified form of thinking, feeling, sensing, perceiving, conceptualizing, and knowing. Thinking, feeling, sensing, conceptualizing, and knowing. How do I experience my body? Well, as qualia, which are modes of, I would like to say, qualia, qualities of consciousness. Qualia are modes of knowing, thinking, feeling, intuiting, knowing, perceiving. And therefore, everything that we call the universe is a modified form of consciousness. It's generated in this dimensionless reality and then experienced as mind-body universe, as mind-body universe as a single holistic activity, which we then divide as scientists to look at different parts which don't really exist, because parts are activities of the whole. A part implies a thing, like a noun. But there may be no nouns in the universe, only verbs. What we call a part is like taking a photograph of an activity. A particle is a measurement of an activity. And therefore, we need to start to thinking of observed objects, whether they're in perceptual space or in cognitive space, as modified forms of consciousness, which we can call qualia. In other words, there's nothing other than qualia as the basis of all experience. So this then leads to a new science, because the external world, physical appearance of the universe has been mortally wounded by quantum physics anyway. And this then opens the door for this new science. And that there's only one constant, which we may call the constant of all constants, and that is consciousness. Because you wouldn't be able to measure any other constants without the constant of all constants that is involved in every measurement. And this then becomes the basis of even evolution, that the evolution of species is actually the evolution of the species of consciousness, which are qualia conglomerates. So just as there's me and the mountain, this body, mind, and the mountain, there's an eagle body mind and an eagle body mind's mountain. There's a bat body mind and a bat's body mind mountain. There's an insect body mind, and perhaps the insect has 100 eyes, and it has the insect's body mind's mountain, both emerging as a result of qualia coming from consciousness, which is the ground state of existence, a dimensionless, formless, non-local reality. That as humans, we cannot experience, measure, or conceive of a reality devoid of consciousness. So when that becomes the ground state of consciousness, and it interacts with itself, just like the fertilized ovum I showed you on the first day that interacts with its own self and becomes the 100 trillion cells of our body, each with a different appearance, and each with a different function, and each with a totally different reality. Your stomach cells, your heart cells, your kidney cells, your brain cells, they all came from one single cell. So does consciousness interact with its own self and differentiate into multiple observers, multiple modes of observation, and multiple objects perceived. In fact, multiple is not the right word. Innumerable, as many as there are species. So the multiverse is here right now as innumerable knowers, innumerable modes of knowing, and innumerable objects of knowledge. And every specific form of consciousness, an elephant, a porpoise, a rhesus monkey, experiences the world subjectively. And individual subjectivity remains within the field of consciousness as its source. So pure consciousness would be the source, and all these rivulets would be species-specific consciousness that give rise to these multiple observers, multiple modes of observation, and multiple experiences, perceptual and cognitive, that arise in the form of sensations, images, thoughts, and feelings. And the general term for these is qualia. And this subjective reality is a vast composite of different qualia, such as color, light, pain, pleasure, texture, taste, memory, desire, anxiety, joy, but nothing can be left out. Love, compassion, suffering, hostility, sexual pleasure, religious ecstasy. And at a subtle level, these qualia are perceived as insight, intuition, imagination, inspiration, and creativity. We live in a qualia universe. All our interactions with it are experiential, hence ultimately subjective. Objective data have no independent existence since they must be part of the data collector's experience. The experience of a body is a qualia experience. The experience of mental activity is a qualia experience. The experience of the world and any other worlds is a qualia experience. The I feeling is a qualia experience. The you feeling is a qualia experience. And qualia then allow us to connect everything together through a common property. Every single thing is an aspect of one field of consciousness. And you know, when I say field, you might imagine a vast, infinite field, but that was also a qualia experience. The field itself is dimensionless and formless and therefore inconceivable. As conscious beings processing reality every moment of our lives, we express ourselves in a qualia vocabulary. And even objectivity itself denotes an experience. A language set apart from qualia does not exist. Now, of course, other life forms, such as insects, bacteria, animals, and their worlds, birds and other species have their own qualia niche. It is inaccessible to us, although there might be a leak from one qualia world into another qualia world. And I was thinking the other day, you know, does the dog in the White House know that Obama is an important person? Does the dog in the White House have any idea of the presidency of the United States? Because it doesn't have a language that allows it to create invisible realities. Invisible realities latitude, and longitude. Nations, races, countries, they're all concepts. So, what is the dog's world? How does he treat Obama? Well, he treats the way Obama treats him. That's all that the qualia exchange that matters in this boundaryless, intermingling qualia universe. So insofar as we can interpret other life forms, we are only reflecting the human nervous system's qualia processing. The fact that other lower animals, including insects and birds, also have extremely complex vocabularies, qualia vocabularies, not linguistic vocabulary, is evidence for the creative link between language and reality. So in this scheme, we do not see because we have eyes. We do not hear because we have ears. The organs of perception do not create perception, but are the lens through which consciousness and its qualia create perceptual experience. The perceptual can never be the actual. We perceive what our species has evolved to perceive. What is truly real, the actual, is more primal than the things we can perceive or think about or sense. So qualia science explores the boundary between the perceptual and the actual with the goal of crossing over it. And there's a feedback loop. I think consciousness is recursive. It learns, it generates experience. It then experiences what it has generated. And then it knows its experience. And having known its experience, it repeats the experience and evolves to higher levels of creativity and imagination. And so human consciousness is one specific expressive outlet for the undifferentiated field of consciousness, the one that creates the many. And even though we can interact with other life forms, we cannot know their internal experience. What does the caw of a crow sound to a crow? What does the dog of a bark sound to a dog? It's unlikely that it sounds the same as it sounds to us because we are experiencing our world through the qualia experience that we call the human body-mind. Each living entity creates its own perceptual reality by interacting with the fundamental ground of existence, which is pure consciousness. So this is where I like Don Hoffman's model of the multimodal user interface, which if he's here, he's going to talk about. And the womb of creation is actually beyond space-time and matter and energy. There are as many perceptual realities, which includes physical bodies, brains, and worlds, as there are living entities with their qualia repertoire. So here I would like you to entertain another idea. If all perceptual reality, I'll repeat that, if all perceptual reality, which is this, if all perceptual reality is a representation of a more fundamental reality, then the brain has no privileged position. Why? Because the brain is also part of perceptual reality. If we have to understand this, the brain is another qualia collection which filters the undifferentiated consciousness into this species-specific qualia repertoire. Our sense of subjective experience, sense of empathy with others takes place through the resonance of shared qualia. Birth is the beginning of a qualia program. Death is the termination of a particular qualia program. The qualia return to a state of potential forms, inaccurate, really, description, potential forms, just like I think you say virtual particles. These are words we have to use because we can only use words. As Rumi said, God's language is silence. Everything else is a pure is poor translation. So I'm trying to translate the ineffable, formless experience into words, which are based on experience of form. Great Indian poet Tagore, and if you don't know about Tagore, you should read up his meeting with Einstein, which was about this problem in 1930. And Tagore has a poem where he says, "In this playhouse of infinite forms, I caught sight of the formless. In this playhouse of infinite forms, I caught sight of the formless, and so my life has been blessed." And this formless constantly reshuffles and recycles its qualia conglomerates into new living entities. And at the same time, the whole never loses contact with its parts because the parts are activities of the whole. We do not experience the field itself, we experience the qualia that emerge from the field. Locality is a qualia experience and in the non-local field of consciousness. Quantum mechanics is a mathematical model for measuring qualia mechanics, defined as our set of experiences of nature. Reality can be mapped to resemble what it actually is, but capturing what reality is real, as opposed to the numbers that measure it in small frozen slices, demands that a science be revamped into qualia physics, qualia biology, qualia medicine. Qualia medicine is what we do at the Chopra Center. I showed you those slides the first day where people experiencing meditation and changing their qualia experiences, we could actually measure what happened to the human genome. And Rudy was gracious enough to actually agree to first become part of this experiment, as was Elizabeth Blackburn. And having won a Nobel Prize in medicine and biology, she gave us a lot of credibility. But I think quantum mechanics and classical science are useful for the creation of new technologies. But qualia science could take our civilization in the direction of wholeness and a science which is not based on subject-object split. Because a science based on object split also gives rise to all the things that could be our extinction, climate change and extinction of species, and now risking our own extinction. And there's some evidence now that ancient wisdom traditions in many cultures had recognized this, perhaps not in a way that could be understood by us, but in fact, all the fields of psychotherapy, mythology, archetypes, childhood development, gender studies are in fact qualia sciences. And spiritual practices are not unique or set apart from everyday experiences. Human consciousness looking at itself is a mirror for the field of consciousness. So I'm going to skip all these because we're running short on time. But basically, I have put forward my thesis that the origin of life forms is the differentiation of pure consciousness into multiple forms of life, our qualia conglomerates, life in this world, that the evolution of species is through natural selection, but is much more comprehensive than Darwin's natural selection. And the purpose of evolution is to maximize experience of every kind. And evolution is purpose-driven through each species as it experiments with its environment and gets feedback. And then it is recursive. It expresses itself as signatures, which are genes, epigenes, and neural networks. And it remembers and stores every step of evolution. These are recording devices. I can record experience in the brain, and then I can play it back. And I see that Stuart is approaching me, another qualia experience. So I will stop here with just the final conclusion. And quantum mechanics and classical science will always be useful for the creation of new technologies. But qualia science could take our civilization into the direction of wholeness, healing, and enlightenment. Thank you very much.
Let's have one or two questions before we move on, and then we'll have a little bit time at the end. Dave, come on up.
Hi. Yes, actually, I could answer the question that Rudy, you asked Rudy. Did you ask the question?
Yeah.
About lucidity at terminal? I would say it's a qualia interchange of experiences that you've already had as a result of becoming non-local as the brain is destroyed.
Interesting. Okay, I went to a conference in January where I met Stuart for the first time in Switzerland, and Christoph Koch was there, and he said he was sure that within 20 to 30 years, science will crack the mystery of consciousness. I think he's way off personally, but I saw an interview with Edward Witten, who is the famous mathematician that combined all the 5 string theories into one unified theory, M theory, and he thinks that a theory of everything will come about in the next 20 to 30 years, but consciousness will forever remain a mystery to mankind.
If you want to measure it, it will ever remain a mystery, yes. But if you accept the fact that consciousness is the ontological primitive, then you can explain everything. It is the one constant of every constants, whether it's M theory or... Where is science done? Science is conceived in consciousness. All scientific theories are conceived in consciousness. All experiments are designed in consciousness, and all measurements are also made in consciousness. So science is the offspring. It's a model. It's a story. And it's the best story we have, but it's still a story. Reality cannot be a story. Reality is what creates the story.
Yeah, it seems to me like the further we mine into reality, the nature of reality and consciousness with mind and machine, the greater we seem to extend its fractal geometric complexity, as though consciousness is directly manifesting matter. Yeah.
I would agree with that.
We need to move on. Amna, I promise you'll have the first question for the panel, okay? You were shut out both times, so. Thank you, Deepak. Let's give him a round of applause. So our next speaker is well known to most people here. David Chalmers is a very well-known philosopher. He burst on the scene at the first Tucson conference with his iconic talk on the heart problem. He's moved on to bigger, better, greater things and is really recognized as one of the world's top philosophers of mind and in several other areas. And he will talk today about the virtual and the real. Dave, come on up.
Okay, thanks, Stu. This is going to be a bit of a change of pace. I'm going to be focusing on some philosophical issues about virtual reality technology. Towards the end, I'll connect it to some more general issues about physical and mental reality. But to start with, the focus will be fairly narrow on some current technology. Here is a bit of virtual reality technology that many of you may have heard of. This is the Oculus Rift, which just had its consumer version released a few weeks ago. I actually ordered one of these, and I just got an email from Amazon saying my Oculus Rift has arrived today, so I'm making a big sacrifice by being here. But I have to give this talk in order to be able to charge it to my NYU research account. This is the Oculus Rift together with the Oculus Touch controllers, which gives the impression of being in a virtual world, something like this. Here are two people playing ping pong in virtual reality just by moving around their Oculus Touch controllers, and there's a world of objects there that they can pick up and interact with. Now, virtual reality is great for a philosopher because it raises all kinds of really interesting metaphysical, epistemological, and ethical issues. Is virtual reality real? Is it a genuine reality or a false or fictional reality? Is it somehow on a par with physical reality? There's a very common view that it's not. William Gibson even has called virtual reality a kind of consensual hallucination, as if there's something unreal about it. As this talk goes on, I really want to argue for the view that virtual reality is a genuine form of reality and that it is on a par with physical reality. But first, some definitions. What is virtual reality? A virtual reality environment is an immersive, interactive, computer-generated environment. And rather than running through the definitions of those three things, I'll just illustrate them. Here is the definition of immersiveness. Not virtual reality, virtual reality. So it's immersive when it's right up there in front of your eyes, generating the 3D impression of a world around you. If it's just a 2D image on the screen, then that doesn't count as immersive. It might still be a virtual world, but not genuine virtual reality. How about interactiveness? Well, here's an illustration of interactiveness. This is actually me playing virtual tennis against Maria Sharapova. Last year at the US Open, they had a virtual tennis exhibition where you put on a headset and you got to inside the VR. I'm moving my tennis racket and hitting the tennis ball. I actually did pretty well. I got the ball over the net, maybe once. But importantly, it's interactive. My actions are actually making a difference to what happens in the VR, as opposed to something more passive and movie-like where you don't affect it. Now, so far, these two conditions, immersiveness and interactiveness, are not just satisfied by virtual reality, they're satisfied by perfectly ordinary physical reality, which is, I take it, immersive and interactive. What makes virtual reality distinctive is that it's computer-generated, that somehow this virtual world that you're interacting with is grounded in processes inside a computer. At least the orthodox view is that ordinary physical reality is not that way. Of course, some people have entertained the hypothesis that it is, but that's still at best a speculative hypothesis, that our world is itself some kind of simulation. So that's virtual reality. It's also worth making a distinction between permanent and temporary virtual reality. Permanent virtual reality is very familiar to philosophers and science fiction, the kind of hypothesis that we've been living in virtual reality our whole lives. One of the VRs, such as The Matrix. Actually, a number of years ago at the Tucson conference, I talked about the philosophical status of a permanent VR, such as The Matrix. But here I really want to focus on something much more mundane and present with existing technology, temporary virtual reality, where you just go in, use a headset, you engage with a virtual world for a while, and then you come out. Something that you might do with current technology, like the Oculus Rift or the Samsung Gear VR or whatever. What's the philosophical status of that? So a lot of this is going to involve virtual objects and the status of virtual objects, the objects that you find in a virtual world. We'll say these are the objects contained in the virtual worlds that we seem to perceive and interact with. Paradigms of virtual objects will be avatars, the virtual bodies that we use to interact in a virtual world, virtual buildings, virtual treasures, and so on. I'll also be talking about virtual experiences, the conscious experiences that one has when using a VR. And I want to be talking about the interaction and the status of these virtual objects and their virtual experiences. The big questions I'll be addressing are four. One about virtual objects. Are they real? Are they fictional? One about events in virtual worlds. Do they, in fact, really happen? One about virtual experiences and their guide to reality. Are virtual experiences illusory? Are they illusions? Or are they somehow non-illusory, revealing genuine facts about the world? And fourth is a question about value. Are experiences in VR as valuable as experiences outside it? These are all, I think, take it questions that are going to become more and more pressing as we spend more and more time in virtual worlds. People already are spending a lot of time in non-immersive virtual worlds, video games, Facebook, whatever. I take it that over coming years, we're going to be spending more and more time in these virtual realities, and questions like these are going to become really quite pressing, especially the fourth. How valuable, how real, how worthy is experience in VR? So the view I want to defend is one I'll call virtual realism. Virtual objects are real. Virtual events really happen. Virtual experiences are non-illusory. And experiences in VR are as valuable as experiences outside it, or at least that they can be as valuable as experiences outside it. So virtual reality is on a par in many ways with physical reality. The opposing view is virtual irrealism. Virtual objects are not real. Virtual events do not really happen. Virtual experiences are illusory, and experiences in VR are less valuable than experiences outside it. Now, virtual irrealism is probably the dominant view. And there's a particular version of it that's particularly popular, which is that virtual worlds and virtual objects are fictional. They don't really exist. They at best exist in the way that objects in fictions exist, like in Lord of the Rings. You know, Middle-earth is and Gandalf. Gandalf is a virtual character, and Middle-earth is a virtual, Middle-earth is a fictional world, and Gandalf is a fictional character. On this view, the virtual worlds of virtual reality are like Middle-earth and Gandalf. They don't really have first-class existence status. They're merely fictional. If you take that view, you'll get a view I call virtual fictionalism. Virtual objects are fictional objects. Virtual events take place only in fictional worlds. Virtual experiences involve illusory perception of a fictional world, and experiences in virtual reality have the sort of value that engagement with fiction has, which is maybe some kind of value, but a much more limited, I take it, kind of value than the kind of value you get from or general interaction with a non-fictional reality. So my view, just to presage, is quite different from virtual fictionalism. It's a view I'll call virtual digitalism. Virtual objects are digital objects, computational objects, somehow tied up to computation, that really exist. Virtual events are digital events that really happen. Virtual experiences involve non-illusory perception of a digital world, and life in digital virtual reality is, or can be, about as valuable as life outside it. Maybe that's initially counterintuitive, but it's a view I want to defend. So I'm going to take the 4 questions one by one in what follows, starting with the one about virtual objects. Are virtual objects real or fictional? I think it's plausible that at least some video games, for example, involve fictional worlds. You play the Lord of the Rings video game set in Middle-earth, well, if the movie and the novels and so on are fictional, so is the video game. That's pretty plausible. Or video games with alternative courses of history for the Second World War, those are pretty clearly fictional. I mean, here's one involving Hitler and the true holy spear and the Nyarya Thotep. I take it none of that stuff ever actually happened to Hitler. So this is pretty clearly fictional. However, I mean, these video games, I think, involve fictions, not because they're virtual, but because they're games, and in particular because they're role-playing games. If we reenacted something about Gandalf or something about Hitler here in the physical world with our ordinary physical bodies, it would be equally fictional because it's a game, not because of virtuality or otherwise. Furthermore, not all video games involve fictions. There are games like Tetris or Pong or Second Life, even, nothing particular to do with role-playing, just certain forms of interaction. And then a fictional element is much harder to find. And importantly, not all virtual worlds are game worlds. People are already using VR for training or communication. It's more and more, I think, going to be used as a social medium. And then the fictional elements, I think, tend to drop out of the picture. So fictional role-playing video games, I think, are a misleading model for VR in general. We take Second Life, for example, very well-known virtual world platform, which people use just for, not so much for gaming, but for general interaction. 2 people's avatars walk into a room and talk with each other in Second Life. Where's the fiction here? So here's the scenario. A couple of people walk into a room in VR, they're avatars, and they have a very mundane conversation. So where's the fiction here? I mean, if there's a fiction, I take it it's fictional that they have these avatars, that there's a room, that the avatars are in the room, and so on. But I think that's, my own views, that is the wrong way to think about what's going on in a virtual world such as Second Life. in Second Life, people really do have these avatars. They're virtual bodies, not physical bodies, a different kind of thing, but equally real. The room is a virtual room, not a physical room, but equally real. The avatars, the virtual bodies, really are in the virtual room. There's nothing at all fictional about those claims. Those are just genuinely true claims about reality. I mean, then, of course, that raises the question, what is a virtual object, such as an avatar? And I want to say it's a digital object, constituted by computational processes. Most likely, it's a data structure, or something constituted by data structures, something that really exists on, for example, the servers of Second Life, or on your own computer if you're interacting with a virtual world that's supported there. I mean, I take it that every virtual object in Second Life corresponds to a data structure on their servers. When I see a virtual object, like someone else's avatar, it's that data structure that causes my experience. When two virtual objects interact, these data structures really are interacting. Those are real objects in the real world that are interacting and causing my experience. I think you could actually use this to mount a couple of philosophical arguments for virtual realism, particularly for virtual digitalism, about these objects. Intuitively, virtual objects have certain causal powers to affect. Avatars affect other virtual objects. The balls in the ping pong room are all kind of knocking each other around. Virtual objects affect other virtual objects. They affect users. Digital objects really have those causal powers. When you're interacting with this stuff on the Oculus Rift, there's something going on inside your computer which is actually causing your experiences interacting with each other, and nothing else does. So, conclusion, virtual objects are digital objects. It's digital objects on the computer that play these causal roles. There's also an argument from perception. When using virtual reality, we perceive, very plausibly, virtual objects. Also a very plausible general claim about perception. The objects we perceive are the causal basis of our perceptual experiences. Well, when using VR, it sure looks like the causal basis of our perceptual experiences are certain digital objects, certain processes going on the computer. Putting all those three premises together, you get the conclusion, virtual objects are digital objects. Now, there's a lot that the fictionalist might say in response to this, and it leads to a complicated dialectic, but you can at least see this as making an initial case. One thing the fictionalist might do is make some kind of counter argument, just along the lines of, come on, look, this avatar is supposedly a dragon. Okay, here's my avatar, it's a dragon. Okay, come on, there are no dragons in the real world. We know that perfectly well. No real object is a dragon, therefore, my avatar is not a real object, because there are no dragons. Well, I think the response to this is reasonably clear. So my avatar, sure, my avatar is not a physical dragon, and there are no physical dragons. My avatar is a virtual dragon, which is quite distinct from a physical dragon. The virtual dragon is a real digital object which really exists on the computer. So the virtual dragon is real. So this now leads us into the second question about virtual events and properties. Do virtual events really happen? Do virtual objects have the properties we take them to have? So even if virtual objects are digital objects, you might worry, digital objects do not have the properties that virtual objects have or seem to have, like color, like size, like motion, and so on. You know, my avatar is a certain shade of red. And you might say, okay, just say it's a certain shade of red that nothing in the real physical world has. Certainly the digital object needn't have it. If you look inside the computer, that digital object is probably not painted red. You know, you're not going to find redness there inside the computer. So the dragons being red doesn't correspond to reality. Well, here there's a very natural response. My avatar is not red in the ordinary physical sense, but it's virtually red. And the digital object is virtually red too. Just as we distinguish physical dragons from virtual dragons, let's distinguish physical redness from virtual redness. What is virtual redness? Well, what is redness in the first place? Tough question, but it's something like redness is that property of physical objects that goes along with the power to cause a certain kind of experience, conscious experience of redness, under normal conditions. Well, we can just translate that kind of account to virtual redness. Virtual redness is roughly the power to cause that kind of experience under conditions which are normal for virtual reality. Of course, the conditions which are normal for virtual reality are quite different from those that are normal for ordinary physical reality. It's something like viewing through a headset. The data structure really does have that power under normal for virtual reality conditions, and presumably the property that causes that is some kind of entry in a data structure encoding the color. That might be what we identify virtual redness with, and the digital object really will be virtually red, just as a physical object is physically red in virtue of having some physical property on its surface. Likewise, I think for virtual space, which is really a very interesting topic in its own right. You might say, oh, come on, these things in virtual reality seem to have certain spatial relations. Things seem to be 2 meters long. There's nothing in the computer that's 2 meters across. So I think we also have to separate virtual distances, virtual shapes, and so on for virtual objects. And I think the story for space is relevantly analogous to the story for color. What's virtual space? It's whatever causes spatial experiences and guides quasi-spatial interactions. I actually think that's the right story for physical space too. You start looking at quantum mechanics, you start looking at relativity, space gets very complicated. I think ultimately space is identified via its functional role. Once you tell that kind of story, it works very well for virtual reality too. I call this spatial functionalism, where space gets identified as what plays the space role. Well, virtual space also gets identified as what plays the space role inside the computer. In virtual worlds, there really are certain patterns of interaction among virtual objects. What's distance, for example? Distance, I love this little saying due to Brian Cantwell Smith, that take the old statement, there's no action at a distance. And you might have thought that was a substantive claim about distance, but you reconstrue that as a definition of distance. Distance is what there's no action at. Distance is a measure of the potentiality for action. Something like that works really well for thinking about relativity and quantum mechanics in an appropriately qualified form. Likewise for virtual reality. Virtual space, and indeed physical space, emerges from patterns of causal interaction. Okay, so that's the beginnings of a metaphysics of virtual objects and virtual properties. Now to bring the mind in. What about illusions? Are virtual experiences illusory? You might say, sure, these things are real, but somehow our perception of them still involves an illusion. Is perceptual experience in virtual reality illusory in that it reveals the reality the way it is, a way it's not? Or is it veridical, revealing it the way it is? Or in less technical language, when experiencing VR, are things the way they look to be? So my claim is that at least for many users of temporary VR, many or most experiences will not be illusory. And I'd like to motivate this by an analogy with the experience of looking in a mirror. Is ordinary experience on looking at a mirror illusory? Really interesting question. In its own right, here's Obama looking in the mirror. Is he undergoing an illusion? If there's an illusion, it's that there's a person out there through the glass, on the other side of the glass. When there's not, that's one view. The other view is he's seeing himself roughly where he is, and he's correct. View one, the illusion view. It appears that there are objects so arranged on the far side of the glass where there aren't, an illusion. View two, it appears there are objects so arranged on the near side of the glass where they really are, not an illusion. Well, what's the right view? I think you can certainly get both kinds of cases. In some cases, mirror experiences clearly seem illusory. Sometimes you don't even know that a mirror is present. You just take it. There are things on the other side of the glass. It seems that way perceptually. That's an illusion. But for an expert user of mirrors who knows a mirror is present, I think there's no illusion. And my favorite case is the rearview mirror of a car. When driving a car and looking in the rearview mirror, do the cars visible in the mirror perceptually appear to be in front of you or behind you? So here you are, driving down the road, looking in the rearview mirror. One line, do the cars there look to be in front of you or behind you? One line, the illusion view will say, it actually seems to you perceptually that there are cars out there on the road, weirdly facing towards you, but staying a constant distance from you as you go along. I don't know, my experience of driving is just not like that. To me, it perceptually seems that the cars are behind me at a constant distance, and that's where they seem to be. Here's a sunset in the rearview mirror. Does it seem like the sun is shining up through a hole in the road, perceptually? No. For an expert user of cars and rearview mirrors, the sun seems to be behind you. Our knowledge of mirrors has somehow penetrated our experience. Phenomenologically, it just seems incorrect to say that the cars visible in the mirror appear to be in front of you. They appear to be behind you. There's a lot of dialectic around here, but I'll skip over it. What are the key features of the car case that make it a plausible case of non-illusion? I think partly knowledge, we know it's a mirror. Partly familiarity, we're used to using the mirror. Partly a connection between action and experience. Like we've learned dispositions to react to mirrors that depend on it. You know, like seeing objects in the mirror, it comes up fast, you steer away, and so on. That's very important. And there's something also perhaps about the naturalness of one interpretation compared to the other that plays a role. So I think this is plausibly a case of what philosophers sometimes call cognitive, and psychologists call cognitive penetration. What you know or believe makes a difference to how things are perceived as being. Depending on whether or not one believes it's a mirror, objects seem to be in front of or behind the glass. So cognition makes a difference to perception. More specifically, I call this the cognitive orientation of perception. Background knowledge somehow determines the general orientation of how things seem to be in a perceptual experience. So perception changes with what one believes. Anyway, I've gone through all this about mirrors because I think everything I've said about mirrors applies to virtual reality and to the question of, is the experience of virtual reality an illusion? So here's a subject, here's a fanciful depiction of a subject in VR. Is she undergoing an illusion or not? I think it's analogous to the mirror case. One certainly can get illusions in VR. For example, if you enter VR, say for the first time without knowing it's a VR, you'll perceive objects as in front of you in ordinary space when the objects aren't there. So here's a picture. This guy's been a bit of a bender, I take it, and someone's put a Google Cardboard VR device onto him, and he doesn't know he's in VR. He's like, oh man, what's going on out there? And undergoing the illusion that all this is going on in physical space. But what about after much time in VR, when you know it's in VR? Well, then I think it's analogous. So here's Palmer Luckey, the CEO of Oculus that got bought out by Facebook for $2 billion. He's presumably interacted with VR a whole lot. Well, I think that after some time in VR, you adapt to VR, treating it as a separate space with separate objects. You take the objects to be located in a virtual space as they are. You perceive the objects as located in a virtual space too. And that's an accurate guide to virtual reality. Rather than having the illusion this is going on in physical reality, you've got the accurate perception of virtual reality. I think just as you get cognitively oriented to using a mirror, you get cognitively oriented to VR with corresponding novel sorts of action dispositions. For example, here's Magic Leap. This is a mixed or augmented reality technology where somehow the headset manages to project the image of an elephant into your real hands, and you can somehow interact with both. And I have the sense that expert users of VR are able to distinguish the two, and you actually have a kind of a phenomenology of virtuality. That the things which are virtual, you've got a sense of which things are virtual. The cognitive orientation to VR is associated with a distinctive phenomenology of virtuality. At least initially, is going to go along with very distinctive action dispositions. For example, in VR, objects tend to be visible and audible, but not tangible. You can put your hand right through them, and that's a different kind of sensory motor action disposition that's associated with the object, which I think is going to give it a different kind of phenomenology, a different kind of conscious experience of perceiving objects that one knows to be virtual. I think as we use VR more and more, this non-illusion view is going to seem increasingly plausible. I talked to a few people who develop VR and virtual worlds, and they already think this is kind of the obvious view of VR, that it's a real world that we're accurately perceiving as virtual, not a fictional world that we're inaccurately perceiving as physical. There's also the question about virtual value. Are experiences in VR as valuable as experiences outside VR? There's a famous thought experiment here that philosophers love, Robert Nozick's case of the experience machine, put forward in his 1974 book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, that sometimes is read as casting doubt on the value of life in VR. Suppose there's an experience machine, would give you any experience you desired, the super duper neuropsychologists stimulate your brain so you think and feel you're writing a great novel, making a friend, reading a book. All the time you're floating in a tank with electrons attached to your brain. Should you plug into this machine for life? Pre-programming your life's experiences. And Nozick gives the answer no, a very resounding no. Many people take this to cast doubt on whether life in VR is really worth living. Well, Nozick turns out to have three main problems with the experience machine. First, it's pre-programmed, so you have no autonomy. Second, it's illusory. The experience you have are illusory. You want to actually do things, not to have the experience of doing them. And third, it's artificial. He thinks we value natural reality as opposed to human-made reality. I think none of those, well, all of those are fairly weak reasons for worrying about VR. One thing, genuine VR is interactive, not pre-programmed. You go into Second Life, or even a video game, what happens is to some large extent up to you, not pre-programmed. Certainly in an open-ended virtual world, the pre-programming objection that raises worries about autonomy doesn't arise. And if I'm right, VR is really non-illusory. One really acts in VR. When one moves one's body, one really is genuinely perceiving an action of one's virtual body, not one's physical body, but none the worse for that. And yes, it's true that VR may be artificial and one may have some valuing of the natural, but hell, so are cities, So is New York City. It's an artificial city. It's okay, it's not to everyone's taste, but it's still a place where people manage to lead pretty valuable lives. So this is just, this is to some extent, more a matter of taste or a matter of having genuine value or lacking it. So I'm inclined to say VR has the same sort of value as certain bits of physical reality. Maybe the artificial bits, maybe the newly developed bits. Yes, it lacks a certain kind of history. I'd like to make an analogy with something like terraform reality. Just say we had a technology to design new physical planets designed for new experiences. They would lack some sources of value, naturalness, history, but many new sources deriving from all the new kinds of experiences we could have there. So I think life in VR is in principle on a par with life outside VR when it comes to value. So virtual reality is not, on this view, a second-class reality. It's potentially a first-class reality. Okay, so in the time I have left, I just want to say, I've addressed now those four questions. I just want to say something about the underlying philosophical view of reality that might lead one to say that virtual reality is genuine reality, not a second-class reality. There's one natural view that might tend to lead there. That's the one that's probably already been thinking about, the view known as idealism. For some virtual realists, what drives their view is idealism. All reality is mental reality. And in fact, I think we heard Deepak articulating a version of idealism in the last talk. There's a famous version due to George Berkeley. He says, esse est percipi. Basically, to be is to be perceived. If you have the appearances, you have the reality. In VR, you have all the appearances of a normal reality, so you have the same reality. And I think idealism could get us to a virtual realist conclusion, but it's not a route that I want to take. At least one canonical form of idealism is what we might call observer idealism, where reality is constituted by the perceptions of ordinary observers, like those of human observers, for example. So when Deepak talks about the human universe, it's this picture that I hear. Now, I think there's a fatal flaw for observer idealism, which is that the universe is constituted by our observer experiences. You need some kind of non-observational reality, some non-observer constituted reality to explain what observers observe. When a scientist does an experiment for the first time, when 10 scientists independently do experiments for the first time and come up with a surprising result, and they all get the same result. We need something to explain that remarkable coincidence of their experiences, and that needs to be some reality outside their experiences. When we go to Antarctica, or when we go to Pluto for the first time and have novel experiences, you need something outside our experiences to explain the experiences. Ultimately, to explain all of those regularities within our observations and our experiences, you need something external to our observations with something like the fine structure of physical reality. some fine structure that goes way beyond the structure contained within our experiences. So that's by Worry for, say, the human universe view. But there is a view nearby, which I like, which is a kind of structuralism about reality, and in particular about physical reality. There's a physical world outside our minds, but our grasp on physical reality is structural. We grasp it as a certain pattern of causal mathematical structure. So, it's like this is really our grasp on physical reality. Its intrinsic nature is not really revealed to us, but we do have very good reason for believing in this fine structure of certain entities and certain interactions outside of ourselves. And it's really the structure that we get a grasp on, not the intrinsic nature. It may have an underlying intrinsic nature, but if so, we don't know what it is. And it could even be that the underlying intrinsic nature involves consciousness. Maybe, for example, it's the mind of God with all that fine structure, or maybe, perhaps more plausibly, it's a whole lot of panpsychist particles with all of that consciousness of those particles is underlying the structure. But you need all that fine structure for physical reality. And those are just two hypotheses among many for what the intrinsic nature could be. So I think when we think of virtual reality as less real than physical reality, we're basing this on the illusion that we have an intrinsic grasp of physical reality. We think that we grasp what solidity really is, or what spatiality really is. And we feel that VR just isn't solid in the same way that virtual stone isn't solid. It doesn't really take up space in the same way. It doesn't have that intrinsic essence of solidity or spatiality. But I think once you recognize that really, especially in light of modern science, what we really grasp about solidity is its effects on us. What we really grasp about space is certain modes of interaction. We really just grasp the structure of these things. Our grasp on physical reality is no different in principle than it seems from our grasp on virtual reality. It's all a bunch of structure. So in virtual reality, the structural reality is present. I think the causal mathematical structure really exists inside the computer. The structure is realized by more basic processes, for example, inside the computer, but that's very common with structures. So I'm going to say, in virtue of sharing that kind of common structure, VR is just as real as physical reality. I mean, if you like, here's my slogan about the elements of reality. Mental reality, which is consciousness, and structural reality, the physical world, come together to yield reality. In VR, the structural reality is present in the computer. The mental reality is also present in the mind of the user. Structural reality plus mental reality come together to yield genuine reality. The open question then is, what's the relationship between mental reality and structural reality? And alas, I'm not going to be able to answer that one here, but it's a classic question in the study of consciousness. Really, I think there are about 4 options. One is mental reality is reducible to and grounded in structural reality. That's the functionalist view. And for well-known reasons, I and many others at this conference reject that as too deflationary about the mental. There's also the view that structural reality is grounded in mental reality, or at least in the structure of mental reality. And there are panpsychist views, for example, that manage to take that line. That's a view that's getting a lot of discussion at the conference. There's also the view there's a common ground to the two, something proto-mental, proto-structural that grounds both, or just the view that they're distinct, which is a kind of dualism. My own view is all of these are, to some extent, options, but one needs to recognize 2 fundamental components here, the structural and the mental, or maybe the proto-mental, and any viable option has got to recognize both the structural and the mental, or something like it, as elements. So anyway, I'll just wrap up with my general conclusions. The conclusion about reality I can put as a kind of equation. Reality equals structural reality plus mental reality. And my conclusion about virtual reality, more specifically, is that virtual reality is not, or at least need not be, a second-class reality. It really can be a first-class reality. Thank you very much.
Let's take a question or two for Dave. Deepak, why don't you come up while we're doing that, please? Who's ready? Go ahead.
I'm ready. I'm really excited about Dave's idea of virtual realism. I understand that it is consistent and really very closely related to digital realism. I want to ask whether there would be a version of virtual realism, broad virtual realism, that would incorporate a broader view of virtual reality. For instance, if somebody hooked up to our brain and created virtual reality, that would be a non-digital virtual realism. And also there's an older view on virtual reality before digital. You know, a Chinese theater with dancing shades, something like that. So I would propose that we have narrow virtual realism that really counts very well and agrees very well with virtual reality the way most people understand it today, and a broad one.
I'm happy to allow there are different notions of virtual reality here. And it's true that Antonin Artaud, who first introduced the term La Réalité Virtuelle, used it for the theater, and nothing digital about that. I think the most common contemporary usage is for something computer generated, and that's what my conclusions apply to. But it's also true that insofar as all this structure is realized in something non-computational, for example, and perhaps even in the minds of other people could come to realize this structure, or perhaps if the universe is some giant it from bit metaphysics, then the conclusion would also apply. So it's an interesting question just how far one could extend it. But given what I say about the end, about the structure being what mattered, I'd be prepared to extend the conclusion to arbitrary ways of realizing this structural reality.
One more for Dave.
Hey, Dave. So talking about virtual structuralism, one issue that comes about in certain VR worlds, particularly gaming, is exploiters. People basically coming in and breaking the rules of the game, changing the laws of physics within the game. Now, that is obviously not something that we encounter in any of our real-life experience.
I think I might have heard about that in a couple of concurrent sessions here.
Is that introducing a fiction, then? At what point is it less of a reality if someone is introducing a fiction into that virtual world that was not intended by the original programmers?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, to what extent is breaking the laws possible? Of course, some people believe that breaking the laws is possible in our world and that, for example, gods get to do it from time to time. I think it really comes down to I'm inclined to think that just if in our physical reality God or some of us had the capacity to break the laws of physics on occasion, that wouldn't make this world less real. It would just make it kind of more interesting and a little bit more chaotic. Now, maybe there's an end of the spectrum where if it turns out there are no laws at all, it's all chaos and all bets are off and anything anyone ever wants to happen can happen, then it's lacking at least some of the stability and order that we want of a genuine reality. But I think even, we can read stories in the Bible about miracles happening without that challenging our sense of this being real. Likewise, I think in virtual reality, if there are just occasional breakages of the laws due to loopholes in the game design, that isn't enough to make it unreal.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you.
Let's open it up to both. There are long lines, so please make your questions brief. No.
Okay, yes, I want to interact to Deepak talk. First of all, I agree with him that consciousness is ontological and fundamental in life since the beginning of the Big Bang. And in fact, it encompasses everything from the galaxies to the single atom and to the molecule. So I think of a unified field of energy, conscious energy, that will represent consciousness. However, as far as his body-mind is concerned, well, I break down the mind into heart and brain interaction. And the intelligence of the heart is the basis of human consciousness that is going to bring the transformation and new shift in the paradigm of human life. Only through our emotion, our heart, that we are going to make peace, love, compassion, and acceptance of the others. Thank you.
Peace, love, compassion, joy are qualia experiences, and they're the most significant. whether they're localized to the heart, to the brain, or they're part of existence is a moot point because, as Schrodinger said, consciousness cannot be divided or multiplied. In his view, it was a singularity. But yes, the heart has reasons that reason doesn't know, as Blaise Pascal said.
Hi, quick question for Dave. I really like the way you emphasize the role of value in VR. And I wonder, however, since we're talking about temporary VR, whether the real question should be what the value of experiences in one form of reality, virtual or physical, have for our experiences or actions in the other, because we're always swapping between. So in VR, for instance, we already know that VR avatar therapy can be very good for schizophrenics or for post-traumatic stress disorder and so on. And likewise in fiction, reading a book can give us a greater understanding of life and whatnot that can then affect how we act in the real world. So the danger then, I wonder if you see this, is where that direction of travel might get inverted, so that now our actions in the real world are taken so as to change our experiences in the virtual world. What about that?
Yeah, I mean, there are many complicated questions about the interaction of life in virtual worlds and life in real worlds. There's a nice cartoon I didn't get to show of somebody just jumping off the cliff, and they say, well, that worked totally fine in this video game I was just playing, but then you see them crashed in a heap at the bottom of the heap. I mean, in a way, it's surprising we managed to separate them as well as we do. And I think that might have something to do with the cognitive orientation to virtual worlds. It goes along quite naturally with situationism in psychology. One develops a set of affordances that are distinct for certain kinds of reality, but there's also a lot of crosstalk, and obviously that can create dangers. Violent behavior, which is paradigmatic in many video games, could, at least in principle, lead to that kind of behavior being more tolerated in non-virtual reality. And as far as I can tell, the data on that is still a bit unclear. But you were worried about moving in the other direction?
Well, it's just, it seems to me that you were trying to say that they could be as valuable as each other.
Yeah.
But my counter-argument to that would be that almost, as you said, that if you kill someone in a virtual world, it doesn't really matter that much. If you do it in the real world, it matters a great deal. And so our experiences might have equal value in the sense that we're dealing with real virtual objects, and I completely agree with that. But there does seem to be an asymmetry in terms of the consequences of our actions in these different worlds.
Yeah, now there is an asymmetry tied to birth and death, I think. Birth is a lot harder in a virtual world, bringing new lives into existence, except maybe for artificial virtual agents, which we haven't gotten to yet with current technology, and likewise death. Unlike in the Matrix and the Oculus Rift, if your character dies, you don't die. Now, you can imagine that in a very long term, and I gather in World of Warcraft, when you die, you just got to go to the nearest graveyard to get reincarnated, so it's not a big deal. You can imagine a virtual reality where when you die in the VR, you can't re-enter, and if you've been spent many years there building up a history, death could be very serious, but it's true that you would still get to exist in the next level up. Whether anything like that goes on in physical reality, I leave to the theists here, but I do agree that it's at least one potential structural disanalogy between the two, and I think Deepak.
I just want to comment that for the last 3 years I've been experimenting with VR, both for spiritual experiences and then medical reasons. So the spiritual game that will be out in 2 months actually allows you to be in a very rich sensory environment of form, and then everything starts shimmering into activity, and then everything disappears into formlessness, and all that's left is formless being. And that is a very experiential understanding of non-locality. And the second application is medical, and it was inspired by Ramachandran's work, where Ramachandran had done this experiment where if you're in a certain arrangement of mirrors and you move your right hand, you get the feedback in consciousness that your left hand is moving. So we are now experimenting with paralyzed patients, and they move, so let's say their left hand is paralyzed, and they keep moving their right hand, but the feedback is the left hand moving. That experience in consciousness, because we don't know where the experience happens. I think everybody will grant that The nervous system is a representation of the experience, but it's not actual experience. Wherever that experience is, I believe it's a dimensionless being, but that experience actually causes synaptogenesis and neurogenesis. And this has huge applications. VR, the best applications I think will be for treatment of phobias, depression, weight control, diabetes, heart disease. I can guarantee you that in 5 years, you go to a good physician and they'll say, well, I have a VR experience for your condition.
I think at Barcelona, Paul Verschuur's group is using VR to treat for neuro rehab already for strokes and whatnot.
A lot of us today are having the experience, a different conscious experience with people online, which we're going to be more of than face-to-face relationships. As we move into VR, the permissions and adaptations with the avatars, the data structures that represent other human beings are only going to multiply. Are either of you looking into the implications of moving to and from the virtual world and the kinds of problems that we might be faced with?
No, not really. I guess no, only in a very superficial way. So far, I think many other people are beginning to look at this. I would just say that these, of course, are problems which are not new to VR, and this general issue of the complexifying of our environments. We take on very different roles. One interacts with people, the same person, even different in a family context to a physical job context. One takes on different roles. I think many of the same social phenomena, which are already happening in a non-virtual environment, will now be extended to a virtual environment. The roles and the personas we take on will come all the more complicated, and I fully expect it's going to bring a whole lot of new phenomena in play. But I take it that the sociologists and the psychologists are thinking hard about that.
So in line with that, if you heard my talk, I think the conclusion is it's all virtual, that the VR world. So I would actually go along with virtual realism, because I think this is also virtual realism. The way this is construed and constructed in consciousness is the same thing. But in answer to his question, you already with the internet, you can give somebody a dopamine hit in South Africa without going there. But if you have a real immersive virtual experience of that, you can affect their well-being and their consciousness.
So what do you think? I'm curious, what do you think about the world outside of our consciousness? So when the scientist does an experiment and a bunch of scientists do the same experiment, is there something external to their consciousness that's bringing that about?
As Niels Bohr said, nature reveals to us not as she is, but to the questions we ask us. And even John Wheeler said, every experiment shows that we agree on the questions and we are participating in the answers that we receive. So we are participating in the creation of every reality. Reality at a fundamental level is experientially, at least, species specific, has to be. And as a fundamental level, all these physical realities are in superposition till the experience happens. And so we agree in science how to do the observations. And we have a nervous system that actually participates collectively as human beings. The only universe you have access to is the human universe. If there are other universes, which we can presume there are, with other species, then they are experientially inaccessible to us.
So if we find results, say, from some experiments from 200 years ago about, say, the coherence of matter, which are only best explained by quantum mechanics, that we, or some other science that we come up with 200 years later, that the standard explanation is this is because there is a mind-independent world of, say, quantum mechanics and the wave function and certain dynamics that explain why experimenters got those results 200 years ago before we ever made up quantum mechanics. Is it somehow when the experimenters performed that experiment 200 years ago, they had to make up quantum mechanics without realizing it to get those results?
Some quantum mechanics says that those results are retrocausal, and delayed choice experiments. And John Wheeler would have said that, and right now Aronoff with his weak measurements is saying that, and I think we're going to hear a lot about you construct the universe when you experience it.